Imagine catching your daughter-in-law cheating and then finding out that your own wife is part of something even worse. This story gets crazier with every twist and turn. Lies, secret affairs and an incredible revenge plan, it's all here. Hey, Alex, it's Tony Stevens, Megan Bailey's brother-in-law. Is Linda there? The noise of my wife, Sarah, yelling and pounding on my locked office door drowned out any sound of Alex hanging up. I waited a couple of minutes, then dialed their house again. Listen, pal, call this number one more time and I'm reporting you to the police. Got it? Yeah, Alex, I get it. But let me tell you something, I'm not worried about the cops, and more importantly, I will be speaking with your wife, and there's not much you can do to stop it. Have a good night. This time, I enjoyed the feeling of hanging up on him. Despite the constant banging on the door, I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and focused on the final big decision of what had been an exhausting day. Should I call my sister-in-law's husband? I asked myself. I first met Sarah back in high school. I was a junior, sitting in the stands with my buddies, waiting for the Friday night football game to start. A group of sophomore girls sat a row in front of us. As the game went on, we took turns getting snacks from the concession stand. When it was my turn, a cute blonde named Sarah tagged along. We grabbed some hot dogs, fries, and sodas, and ended up sitting together. She was smart, funny, and beautiful, and the best part, she didn't have a boyfriend. During the third quarter, someone in the crowd shouted, "Who's going to McDonald's after the game?" The group unanimously decided to head to the McDonald's nearby. Seizing the moment, I turned to Sarah and said, "You know, I'd prefer pizza over fries. Want to go to Tony's Pizza instead?" I was over the moon when she agreed. Sarah and I started dating once a week for the next couple of weeks, and it seemed like we really clicked. After 2 months, we decided to make it official and go steady. Things only got better from there. Sarah was my date to the junior prom, and I felt like the luckiest guy walking into the dance with the most gorgeous girl in school. I was floating on air until I wasn't. 2 weeks later, right before senior prom, I was jogging to tennis practice with my neighbor, Katie Adams, who played on the girls' team. She casually said, "You're such a good guy, you know." "Katie, we've grown up together. Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, puzzled. She gave me a playful punch on the arm and said, "I just think it's great that you're letting Sarah go to senior prom with Danny. He's so shy and awkward, he'd never get to go otherwise. Danny Lewis was a nice guy but shy and kind of geeky. I suspected he might be on the spectrum. He lived near Sarah, and she always looked out for him. I wasn't surprised that she agreed to go to prom with him, but I was upset she hadn't bothered to tell me. By Friday, 6 different people had commented on how mature I was for letting my girlfriend take her friend to the prom. But the truth was, I didn't feel mature at all. I was angry that Sarah didn't have the decency to mention it to me. I knew she'd bring it up on our usual Friday night date, she wouldn't have a choice. That Friday afternoon, right before the date, I sent her a text canceling it. She bombarded me with messages and voicemails, begging me to call her. After a dozen alerts, I finally texted her back, "I've known about your prom date since Monday. At least 10 people told me. Too bad you weren't one of them. I need a girlfriend I can trust, and that's not you." I turned off my phone and brooded. Sarah and I didn't reconnect until the start of the following school year. It was a Friday afternoon, and as I made my way to the student parking lot, I spotted her sitting on the hood of my car. "Care to let an old girlfriend buy you an ice cream at Dairy Queen?" she asked, looking up at me. That was how it started again. We were exclusive for the next 2 years. During the second year, we navigated a long-distance relationship, with me attending college in New York City. I managed to visit home fairly often, and one Saturday night in March, shortly after her 18th birthday, we both lost our virginities to each other. We kept dating until she left for college the following year. 2 weeks into her freshman year, I got a "Dear John" email from her. She explained that she was having way too much fun in college and didn't want to be tied down by a steady boyfriend. I never responded. I was doing well in school, had a solid group of friends, and was playing Division I tennis. The very next night, I moved on and started seeing a steady stream of new girls. I didn't run into Sarah again until 2 years after she graduated college. I was working as an engineer for a defense contractor and was out at a bar with some coworkers after a long week. That's when I literally bumped into her. We exchanged a few words before we both rejoined our respective groups. I couldn't help but keep an eye on her for the next hour, debating whether or not I should follow her out to the parking lot as our group began to break up. I chuckled when, after her friends had left, she went to the bar, ordered a drink, and turned to face me, sitting there with a coy smile. I watched her for a while as guy after guy approached, only for her to quickly turn them down. It wasn't until she locked eyes with me and held up 2 fingers that I made my move. I had to wait for her to send another guy packing before I stood next to her. 2. I asked. Sarah smiled and replied, "Yep." If 2 more guys had asked me out, I would have said yes to the next one. Sarah and I dated for almost 6 months before we made it official and moved in together. 10 months later, we got married and spent nearly 5 years living a happy and fulfilling life. That particular day had started early for me. I had a 7:30 a.m. meeting with a longtime client and friend. We were meeting at the downtown Marriott in New Haven, Connecticut, home to an overrated Ivy League university that starts with Y. Tony was already seated in the conference room I'd booked. We chatted for a bit as I set up my laptop, laid out all the necessary paperwork, and poured myself a steaming cup of black coffee. Tony works as a civilian contractor for a company that's involved in developing the Navy's next-generation submarine propulsion systems. I'm a senior mechanical engineer for a defense contractor that specializes in marine mechanics. Over the last few years, we'd successfully collaborated on 3 smaller but crucial contracts. Lately, though, we'd both been facing pushback from our superiors on the current deal. We were told this was our last chance to resolve the 7 critical issues left on the table before someone else from each of our companies would step in to take over negotiations. Tony and I worked straight through lunch, only pausing to catch our breath at around 2:15 in the afternoon. "Do you think your company will go for it this time?" Tony asked, leaning back in his chair. I shrugged and answered truthfully, "I still don't understand why our last 2 proposals were rejected." Tony scratched his head and mused, "You and I have gotten pretty close over the last few years. Do you think they're testing us to see if we're too chummy?" I chuckled and admitted, "I've had the same thought," then gave a tired stretch and shrugged again. "How about we grab a drink?" Tony suggested. I held up my notepad and said, "I've got over 30 pages of notes to sift through. A drink's not gonna make that any easier. I'm gonna stick around here and transcribe the key points into my laptop. I'll send you a memo of understanding by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Let's hop on a call right away if there's anything unclear. I've got to submit my final report by noon." "Sounds good," Tony replied as he packed up his laptop. I walked Tony through the lobby of the hotel, and after he left, I made a quick stop at the gift shop to grab a Diet Coke before heading back to the conference room. The moment I stepped inside, though, I felt an odd sense of claustrophobia, like the walls were closing in on me. Deciding a change of scenery was needed, I gathered my things and relocated to a quiet corner in the hotel lobby. After checking in with the office, I learned that a few minor issues had come up during the morning. I quickly texted Sarah, letting her know she should go ahead and have dinner without me. Once I settled into a cozy chair in the lobby, I got back to work. The fresh setting did the trick. I managed to plow through a ton of work over the next couple of hours. I was so absorbed that it's a wonder I even noticed her laugh. But I did, and when I looked up, I spotted Jenny, my sister-in-law, strolling across the lobby in a little black dress and some killer heels. What caught me off guard wasn't just seeing her there, it was the fact that she was arm in arm with a tall, handsome guy who definitely wasn't her husband, Scott. Without even thinking, I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, snapping several photos of them as they checked in. One shot made my blood boil as the guy's hand slid down and gave her backside a firm squeeze. I took a few more pictures as they headed to the elevator, and a final set as they kissed just before the doors closed. I hurried over and saw the indicator light stop on the 8th floor. I was furious and bewildered. I care a lot about Jenny, and Scott is one of my closest friends. I found myself in a daze as I sat back down, the day's tough negotiations blending with the shock of what I had just witnessed, leaving me mentally drained. I didn't even notice the man sitting next to me until he extended his hand. "Hey, I'm Jake, the general manager here at the Marriott," he said as we shook hands. "Nice to meet you, Jake. I'm Adam Spencer. I rented out conference room L22 today," I replied. He gave me a knowing nod and then asked, "I saw you taking pictures of that couple who just checked in. Do you know them?" After a brief pause, I responded, "Yeah, I know the woman. Can I take a wild guess that you weren't expecting to see her with that guy?" "You guessed right." I was definitely caught off guard, I admitted. "Mr. Spencer, mind if I'm straight with you?" Jake asked. I nodded, and he continued, "I've got a feeling things could get messy if you stick around here." I gave a half smile and said, "I've never gotten into that kind of trouble before. But yeah, there's likely to be a confrontation. Don't worry though, I'll walk away before things get heated and disturb your guests." Jake glanced around the lobby, which was relatively quiet, and no one seemed to be paying attention to us. He handed me a folded piece of paper. When I opened it, I saw a man's name and address neatly printed on it. Jake asked, "Think this might help things stay a little more under control?" I shook his hand and said, "I can almost guarantee it." I went back to work, and despite glancing at the elevator every few minutes, I managed to get more done than I expected. Nearly 3 hours later, Jenny and her companion stepped out of the elevator. By then, my bag was packed, and I was already on my feet, making my way toward them before they had taken more than a couple of steps into the lobby. I was holding my phone up, snapping pictures as I approached. Jenny looked confused at first, but when I lowered the camera, her expression shifted, her jaw dropped, and her face drained of color. "I'd give you a kiss like usual, but I'm not really in the mood to taste your boyfriend right now." "Adam, what the hell are you doing here?" "I'm here for some meetings." "What about you? Why are you here?" I could see Jenny trying to pull herself together, forcing a calm tone as she replied, "Adam, I'd like you to meet Rick Chalmers. We work together. We're here to check out some meeting rooms for an upcoming event our agency's hosting." Rick stretched out his hand toward me, attempting to keep things civil. "Good to meet you, Adam," he said. I completely ignored his hand and cut straight to it. "Rick, mind if I ask you something?" Rick and Jenny exchanged uneasy glances before I continued. "Do you think Jenny looks better in these tight jeans, that snug blouse, and those boots," I said, gesturing to her current outfit, "or the hot little black dress she was wearing 3 hours ago when you two were inspecting the meeting rooms on the 8th floor?" Before either of them could recover, I glanced down at Rick's left hand. "Nice wedding ring, Rick. Looks like you're just as much of a lying, cheating pile of trash as my dear sister-in-law." That did it. Rick snapped, hissing through gritted teeth, "Listen, buddy, you don't have a clue what's going on. Keep out of this, and I won't have to kick your ass. I hate to break it to you, Rick, but my sister-in-law sneaking around with a loser like you is my business," I said, placing both hands behind my back. "And about that ass-kicking, you can have the first shot for free. Better make it count, because once you do, I'm gonna lay you out, put you in the hospital, and then call the cops to press charges." I stood there, grinning at him. Rick glared at Jenny and spat, "Can you handle this idiot? I'm leaving." Without waiting for her response, he stormed toward the front door of the hotel. I couldn't help myself. As he walked away, I called out, might want to give your wife a heads up. I'll be making that call soon. Rick froze for a second, his eyes darting toward Jenny before he turned back and muttered, "Take care of this, Jenny." Then he was gone. Jenny put a hand on my arm and asked, "Adam, can we go to the bar and grab a drink? Just talk." It was tempting, but I shook my head. "Sorry, Jenny. I've already wasted enough time waiting for you to finish up your little fling." Jenny flinched at that, but I wasn't done. "I need to get home, have a drink, and figure out how to break the news to Scott, and Rick's wife." She gripped my arm a little tighter and said, almost pleading, "I only do this when Scott's away. It doesn't mean anything. I'm not hurting him." "How long have you known me, Jenny?" She just stared at me, silent. "It's been what, at least a dozen years. Since I first started dating Sarah in high school. Does that sound about right?" I let the silence hang between us before I finally said, anger creeping into my voice, "And after all this time, what makes you think I wouldn't tell my best friend that his wife is a lying, cheating woman?" As I turned to leave, I caught the eye of Jake, the hotel manager, watching from across the lobby. He gave me a subtle nod of thanks as I pushed my way through the revolving door. By then, rush hour traffic had died down, and I started the half-hour drive north on I-91, heading home. I set the cruise control at 78 miles per hour, cranked up the country music, and tried to clear my head. The only thing that bugged me during the ride was my phone constantly lighting up with dings and rings. It seemed like Sarah was desperately trying to get in touch with me. When I finally pulled into the garage and shut the door behind me, I heard her voice. Sarah was standing in the doorway that led from the garage into the kitchen. "Where the hell have you been?" Sarah demanded the moment I walked in. I brushed past her and headed into the kitchen. Dropping my work stuff on the counter, I noticed her phone sitting on the kitchen table beside a half-full glass of wine. I picked it up, punched in her passcode, and pulled up her text messages. Sure enough, the message I sent hours ago had been read. "So, you know exactly where I've been," I said, holding up the phone. "You read my message." "That's not what I meant, and you know it," she shot back. As I made my way to the den to pour myself a bourbon, I tossed over my shoulder, "Then why don't you tell me what you do mean?" When I returned to the kitchen, Sarah was sitting at the table. She looked at me and asked, "What did you do to upset Jenny?" As far as I'm aware, I didn't do anything to upset her. Jenny, on the other hand, has done plenty to upset me. I watched Sarah pause, collecting her thoughts while I sat down across from her. "Did you know that Jenny's cheating on Scott?" I asked, cutting right to the chase. That question hit her like a ton of bricks. "It only happened once," she muttered. "Well, that's a lie," I replied. "Jenny told me she cheats whenever Scott's out of town." After a beat of silence, I pressed on, "And you still haven't answered my question. Did you know your sister has been cheating on Scott?" Sarah sighed, took a long sip from her wine, and said, "Adam, this is between Scott and Jenny." I smiled and replied, "That's the first thing you've said that I actually agree with. The problem is, Scott doesn't even know there's an issue here that needs fixing. God damn it, this is none of your business." Sarah exploded. "I want you to keep your mouth shut." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and laced my fingers together. Calmly, I said, "You know me, Sarah. You know me better than anyone." She seemed to expect more, but instead, I stood up and walked toward the kitchen archway. I paused, then turned back to face her. "I've asked you twice if you knew about Jenny's cheating, and both times, you've dodged the question. So let me ask one more time, how long have you known? You know how Jenny is." "She's always been a little wild," Sarah replied, avoiding a direct answer. 3 years. I shot back immediately. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "It means you're refusing to answer a question that I think is crucial to our marriage." What Jenny does when Scott's away has nothing to do with our marriage, Sarah said with a bit too much confidence. Oh, let's just break this down, shall we? I said, leaning against the archway and counting off on my fingers. First, my relationship with your sister is forever changed now that I know she's a liar. Every single holiday or family event we spend together, I'll be reminded of her betrayal. Second, it's pretty clear to me that you've known about her disgusting behavior, and I'm left wondering if you actually approve. That's not fair, Adam. And third, I continued, ignoring her protest, even though I don't travel as much as Scott, I still go on work trips once a month. For the first time since we've been together, I'm now wondering if you've been unfaithful to me. Her eyes went wide, and she erupted, how dare you accuse me of cheating? I cut in sharply, meeting her intensity with my own. I didn't accuse you of cheating, Sarah. But the way you've brushed off your sister's infidelity has me questioning if you've done the same. I glared at her, the tension in the room thickening. You and I both know there's no way you can prove you haven't cheated. All I've ever had is my trust in you, and right now, that trust is hanging by a thread. I turned and made my way down the hall to my office. After a quick internet search on Rick Chalmers, I confirmed that he was married and found both his home and office addresses. With that done, I turned to the last, dreaded task. I texted my brother-in-law, Scott. You're coming home on Friday, right? It took about 10 minutes before he replied, yeah, I land at 2:30 p.m. Meet me at the pit stop at 4. Does this have anything to do with Jenny's frantic phone call asking if we've talked? I hesitated, trying to figure out how to respond when my phone rang. I answered. Hey, Scott, I said, swiveling my chair to face the wall. I wasn't about to hide what I was saying from Sarah, but I also wasn't going to make it easy for her to eavesdrop through the locked office door. What's going on, Adam? It's as bad as it gets, man. You sure you want to have this conversation over the phone? After a brief pause, Scott asked, is she cheating on me? I took a deep breath and said, yeah. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the occasional sound of quiet sobbing. I'll see you at the pit, he finally said, then the call ended abruptly. I thought about texting him again, letting him know I'd be there if he needed to talk before then, but in the end, I decided to give him some space. Scott knew I was in his corner, and I figured he'd reach out when he was ready. Things had gone quiet on the other side of the door. I was pretty sure Sarah had been trying to listen in. After hanging up, I heard her voice faintly through the door, come to the kitchen. We need to talk. I considered heading to the guest bedroom instead but decided to finish off the bourbon sitting on the kitchen table. Easing myself into the chair across from Sarah, I took a long sip of Knob Creek, letting the warmth settle in my chest. I glanced at her, watching the wheels spin in her head as she prepared for whatever was coming next. My mind was fried. I had no fight left, and I knew that finishing the bourbon wouldn't make things any better. I was waiting for Sarah to say something when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Jesus, I muttered. When will this day end? I fished the phone out and saw a number I didn't recognize, which only added to my frustration. I answered with an irritated, hello. A woman's voice replied, I'm sorry to call so late. My name is Linda Chalmers. Someone from this number called my house twice earlier, and it upset my husband quite a bit. I'm assuming the caller was trying to reach me. With a sigh, I answered, Linda, my name is Adam Spencer. I did call earlier, trying to get in touch with you. Her tone grew more serious. Let me guess, you're calling to tell me that my husband's having an affair with your wife. Close, I replied. He's been cheating with my sister-in-law, Jennifer Palmer. I believe they work together. There was a long pause before she responded, this is the third time I've gotten a call like this, and it'll be the last. How can a man do this to a wife and 4 kids? I knew she wasn't really looking for an answer, so instead, I said, I have pictures of them checking in together at the downtown New Haven Marriott. They kissed in the elevator, and about 3 hours later, they left together. Jenny was wearing a completely different outfit after their little date. The rest of the call was spent exchanging email addresses and agreeing that I'd send her the photos first thing in the morning. When I hung up, Sarah looked at me and said, "Jenny told me that guy was in an open marriage." "That's a lie," I shot back. "His wife and their 4 kids all think they're living in a happy, monogamous family." Sarah's face went pale as she put her hands up to her mouth in shock. I continued, "Apparently, this is the 3rd time his wife's caught him cheating. She's going to divorce him." Sarah just sat there, stunned. I swirled the last bit of bourbon in my glass before tossing it back in one gulp. After rinsing out the glass in the sink, I headed upstairs to our bedroom. Lying in bed, thinking over all the chaos that had unfolded within my family in the past few hours, I realized one thing for sure: I wasn't the one to blame for all this misery and destruction. As usual, my alarm went off at 5 a.m. sharp. Instead of hitting the basement gym for my workout, I jumped straight into the shower, got dressed, and headed to the office. It wasn't that I was avoiding Sarah, I just needed to get to work and finish up the memo for Tony. Thursday turned out to be a busy day. Tony and I had to spend about 45 minutes on the phone, hashing out the wording on a couple of key points, but I got the final agreement to my boss by the noon deadline. The rest of the afternoon flew by as I caught up on emails from the previous day, and by 5 p.m., I was heading home, right on schedule. I had been wondering how the evening would play out, so I wasn't all that surprised when I turned onto our street and saw Jenny's car parked out front, along with her parents' car. "It's going to be a long night," I muttered to myself as I hit the button to open the garage door. "What the hell did you say to Scott?" was the first thing out of Jenny's mouth as I closed the door behind me. Ignoring her for a moment, I shot a hard look at Sarah before saying, "I'm going to change clothes. I'll be back in a few minutes, but let me make one thing clear: if anyone disrespects me in my own home, I'll throw you all out the front door, yes, even you, Sarah." Without waiting for a response, I headed straight down the hall to our bedroom. As I stood there, briefly contemplating climbing out the window and making a break for it, I decided I needed to face Sarah and her family. Walking past my open bottle of bourbon was tough, but I knew it was smarter to keep a clear head. Then again, my second thought was, screw it, and I turned back. 1 inch of bourbon didn't seem like enough, but 2 inches felt like too much for civil conversation, so I compromised with 1.5 inches. When I walked back into the kitchen, all eyes were on me. Everyone was sitting around the table, and there was an empty seat between Sarah and her father, Steve. Instead of sitting, I leaned against the kitchen counter, took a small sip of my drink, and looked at each of them. I've always liked my in-laws. They're good people. Steve, my father-in-law, is a guy I respect. He's direct, honest, and you always know where you stand with him. If you stay on his good side, he's the best friend you could ask for. But cross him, and I'm sure he could make your life a living hell. Steve considered Scott and me close friends. As for my mother-in-law, Betty, she liked to think of herself as a top-notch businesswoman. She ran a well-regarded local real estate franchise, and her reputation was stellar. But anyone who knew the family knew that Steve was the real mastermind behind their success, even though Betty managed the day-to-day operations. "Wouldn't you be more comfortable sitting here?" Sarah asked, patting the chair beside her. "I've been sitting all day." "I'm fine standing," I replied, staying where I was. Jenny had managed to pull herself together a bit. "What did you tell Scott?" she asked. I took a moment before answering. "I texted him and asked to meet up when he gets home tomorrow. Told him it was urgent." I gathered my thoughts, then continued, "He called me, wanting to know what was going on. After making sure he was okay hearing it over the phone, I told him you were cheating. He cried for a while, then confirmed he'd meet me." I was a bit taken aback by how upset the whole family seemed to be. Sarah was in tears, pleading, "I'm begging you, just stay out of this. I couldn't help but wonder if she was saying that more for her family's benefit. I told you, it is my business, I replied. That's when Betty, my mother-in-law, jumped in. Well, that's debatable. Before I could respond, Jenny cut in. Are you really going to meet Scott tomorrow? I am, I said. And what are you going to tell him? She asked. There's not much more to say, I answered. I sent him the pictures I took of you and Mike. Told him you were together for just under 3 hours. I gave him Mike's name, address, and his wife's contact info. I'm guessing my role will be to support him, be a shoulder to lean on. What about me, Adam? Jenny asked. Don't I deserve some support too? I couldn't help but crack a small smile as I looked around the table. From where I'm standing, Jenny, it looks like you've got plenty of support right here. I'll be sticking with Scott on this one. Betty, never one to shy away, chimed in. How do you know Scott doesn't cheat on Jenny when he's traveling? It's not uncommon for married men to stray when they're away from home. Honestly, I can't imagine Scott cheating, but if I'm being truthful, I really don't know how he behaves when he's away. Up until yesterday, I never thought Jenny was the type to cheat, or that my own wife might be. That set off a chorus of, how dare you, and, that's out of line. Sarah looked utterly shocked by my statement, so I quickly jumped in. Look, I told Sarah last night that her dismissive attitude toward Jenny's cheating makes me uneasy. Her father, Steve, leaned forward and said, Sarah's never cheated on you. I can't believe you think so little of her. I knew I had to tread carefully here. I didn't want Steve turning against me. Lowering my voice, I looked him in the eye and calmly said, prove it. The room fell silent for a few seconds before I continued, that's the thing, Steve. You can't prove that Sarah hasn't cheated. I held up my hand to stop the protests before they could start. All I've got is 6 years of complete trust in Sarah. And last night, I told her that trust has been shaken. That's not fair, Adam, Sarah said, her voice trembling. I jumped in before she could continue. I asked you 3 times last night if you knew Jenny was cheating on Scott, and each time, you avoided the question. You didn't lie, but you weren't honest either. Yes, Sarah admitted softly. I've known about Jenny's affairs. I didn't approve, but I didn't want to stir up trouble like this. She waved her hand around, gesturing to the mess we were now in. I hoped her flings would run their course, and Scott would never find out. I nodded. As disappointed as I was that Sarah had kept her sister's infidelity a secret, I could understand why she'd want to protect her. Do you remember that conversation we had about being exclusive, right before you proposed to me? Sarah asked. I nodded again, and she locked eyes with me. I promise I haven't had a romantic or intimate relationship with anyone since that talk. In fact, I haven't been with another man since we started dating after college. Call me a fool, but in that moment, I saw the woman I married 5 years ago, the woman I loved, as she spoke those words. I love you, and I believe you, I told my wife. Her family was gracious enough to give us a few quiet moments before the conversation picked back up. I could see Steve was especially relieved by the way things were going. Betty then asked, so, what are you going to do about Scott? I'm going to stand by my best friend, the same way all of you are going to stand by Jenny. Scott deserves my support, and I'm going to give it to him. The next 6 weeks were tough. Scott moved out of his house and into a nearby apartment. He filed for a legal separation from Jenny but held off on filing for divorce right away. Every Wednesday, I had dinner with Scott, while Sarah kept the same routine with her sister. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was having lunch with a couple of work buddies at Clyde's Barbecue and Bar. We were sitting at a table for 4 when a man suddenly pulled out the empty chair across from me and sat down. Well, look who it is, he sneered. I bet you thought you'd never see me again. It took a moment, but I finally recognized him. Hey, Mike. Heard Colleen kicked you to the curb. How does it feel being a part-time dad? I asked. He scowled and said, "Screw you. This is all your fault." I glanced over at my friends, Carl and Joe, who looked more entertained than anything. Turning my attention back to Mike, I replied, "Oh yeah, your divorce is my fault." Mike chuckled and admitted, "Okay, maybe some of it's on me too. But what can I say? There are just too many married women out there for me to stay loyal." I started to feel uneasy as Mike kept talking. "You see, I've got a bit of a thing for married women. My kink, if you will. And I like to share them with my buddies." He nudged Carl with his elbow. "That's what I did with Jenny, your sister-in-law. When her husband was out of town, I turned her into my personal plaything and shared her with my friends." He winked and added, "She was real popular, man. We had our fun with her for over a year. She loved every second of it. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse," he continued, "I was about ready to move on when I ran into her and her hot younger sister at happy hour." His smirk said it all. Reaching into his back pocket, he pulled out an envelope and tossed it onto the table next to my plate. It was the kind of envelope that held pictures. Mike's grin told me exactly what was inside. I won't lie, my heart felt like it shattered into pieces, but I wasn't about to let this dirtbag see me break. I calmly picked up the envelope and slipped it into the pocket of my jacket. Mike wasn't done trying to get a rise out of me. "Aren't you going to show your buddies? I'm sure they'd love to see the pictures and videos of your wife and her sister screwing my crew. I've been having fun with your wife for 5 months. Jenny's wild, sure, but your wife? She's 10 times worse." I kept my cool as he went on, laughing. "I've got a video of her on her knees, begging us to use her. She loves being treated like a toy." Mike laughed again and then said, "What's the matter, pal? Got nothing to say?" I was grinding my teeth, but I knew I had to respond. "You're easily the dumbest piece of trash I've ever met." He still had that smug grin when I added, "When I hand those pictures over to Scott, he's going to divorce Jenny. And since you're her boss, how long do you think it'll take before he sues you and your company? I'm betting you'll be out of a job by the end of next week." It was tough, but I forced myself to laugh. The idiot had clearly underestimated me and was now trying to figure out his next move. I leaned in a little and said, "Did you know I grew up around here?" "What the hell do I care where you grew up?" the jerk shot back. He had no idea what was coming, but I wasn't in any rush. "I know all the big players in this town." Mike didn't seem impressed, so I continued, "And I also know the worst scum around here. My advice to you? Leave town while you can still walk. Screw you. You think I'm scared of you? I've got witnesses who heard you threaten me," he said, pointing at Carl and Joe. They both laughed, and Joe chimed in, "Wow, you really are clueless. Let me break it down for you. You're getting divorced, losing your kids, and you're going to get fired. You'll be paying alimony and child support. And trust me, you should start watching your back, things aren't gonna go well for you." Mike smugly pushed his chair back, stood up, and sneered, "Screw you, jerk. You're just a cuck with a trashy wife." As he walked away, my mind was spinning out of control. Later, back in my office, I finally worked up the nerve to look at the pictures. They confirmed every nightmare a happily married man could have. There were explicit photos of Sarah with 6 different men. In some, she was with 3 men and another woman. Another batch showed Jenny doing the same filthy acts. The video was worse, far worse, and it shattered me. Sarah and Jenny seemed to relish being the stars of some grotesque orgies, their voices ringing out with cries of, "Screw me harder." Those words will haunt me forever. After sitting in silence for what felt like ages, I pushed the crushing sadness and rage to the side and called Scott, asking him to meet me for dinner. 15 minutes of staring blankly into space later, I invited one more person to join us. Tears welled up in my eyes as I sat at my desk, trying to map out a plan. I knew I couldn't keep up the charade with Sarah. I had to get away. I travel for work about once a month, sometimes planned, sometimes on short notice. I sent Sarah a text, "The Whitaker account's in trouble. I'm heading to the airport." That night, Scott and I had a quiet, somber dinner. After we ordered beers, I slid the stack of photos across the table, the ones Mike had given me earlier. Scott was devastated, not just for himself but for me too. We both agreed that divorce was the only way forward. We also talked about the possibility of suing the insurance company that employed Jenny and Mike. Ultimately, we decided to follow the advice of our divorce attorneys. We'd been sitting at the table for over an hour when I saw Mel walk into the bar. He scanned the room, spotted me, and made his way over. On his way, he stopped to shake hands and chat with a few people at different tables. Was a generation older than Scott and me, and his daughter, Trish, had gone through school with us. He owned a large auto salvage yard just outside town. I'd known for a long time. 15 years ago, when I was 16, I was practicing my tennis serve on the high school courts one summer afternoon. Trish waved as she rode her bike past, and I waved back. A few minutes later, while I was gathering up the scattered tennis balls, I glanced over and saw 5 guys from our school dragging Trish under the bleachers by the baseball field, about 100 yards away. I knew exactly what those punks had in mind, and I knew Trish wasn't that kind of girl. I dropped everything and sprinted across the field. By the time I got there, her shirt had been torn off, and she was screaming and crying as they tried to pull off her shorts. Just as Stan Malloy turned around, the edge of my racket caught him square in the nose. It shattered, blood spraying everywhere, and Stan let out a scream as he collapsed to the ground. My backhand connected with Joey Burns' cheek, and he went down like a sack of bricks. I don't remember much after that. The other 3 punks tackled me and beat the living hell out of me while I was down. After they got in their last few kicks, they panicked and took off. Trish was still crying as I struggled to regain my bearings. We left her bike behind, and she helped me limp to my car. I could barely drive, but somehow, I managed to make it to her house. The moment we stopped, Trish jumped out of the car and ran inside, still in tears. I had to drag myself out of the driver's seat, circle around, and close the door she'd left open. Just as I shut it, I heard a loud crash and looked up to see a giant of a man barreling toward me, his face twisted in rage. It wasn't until he got closer that he saw the state I was in, bruised, beaten, and barely standing. "You're Harrington's kid," he growled. I barely managed to nod. "I think I need an ambulance, Mr. Mel," I groaned, slumping against the car and slowly lowering myself to the ground. Mr. Mel spun around and yelled toward the house, "Call an ambulance. Now." He knelt beside me, grabbed my chin, and turned my head until our eyes met. "What the hell happened to my daughter?" he demanded. "Some jerks dragged her under the bleachers at the baseball field," I muttered through the pain. "Was it you?" he snapped, fire in his eyes. I shook my head. "No, sir. I was practicing at the tennis courts nearby." Each word felt like it took everything I had. His glare softened a bit, but he wasn't done. "What did those scumbags do to my girl?" he asked, barely containing his fury. "They ripped her shirt off and were trying to pull her shorts down when I got there," I managed. "She was still wearing her bra and shorts when I stopped them." If I hadn't been in so much pain, his icy stare would have terrified me. "I want their names," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "I already took care of Stan Malloy and Joey Burns, they'll be in the hospital." I hit them with my racket. The others were Tim Foster, Rick Hayes, and Carl Watson, I told him just as the ambulance and police arrived. Mr. Mel leaned in until we were almost nose to nose, his breath heavy with garlic. In a quiet, menacing tone, he said, "If you ever need a favor, come see Mel." Fast forward to the present, when Mel reached our table, he sat down without needing any introductions. I handed him the envelope of pictures and watched as he thumbed through them. After he was done, he looked up at me, and I said, "There's a man named Michael Charmed. He's a big shot at Jimmy Sullivan's insurance agency. His hobby is seducing married women and then passing them around to his friends. The pictures I just showed you. They're of him and his crew with my wife and my brother-in-law's wife." Mel nodded as I continued, "I'm hoping, in the near future, he's not as good-looking, his walk isn't as smooth, and his confidence as a man takes a serious hit." We sat in silence for a few minutes before finally spoke. "You're both gonna be single soon. Might be a good idea to start going to the gym. You could go every night after work, together, and then grab dinner afterward." He looked at our confused faces for a moment, then added, "Do you idiots realize how important it is to have airtight alibis?" Once we understood what he was getting at, he rolled his eyes, nodded to me, and walked out of the bar at a slow, deliberate pace. I didn't go home that night, not with Sarah thinking I was out of town. Instead, I checked into a nearby Marriott. I called my boss and gave him a short version of what was happening. He was understanding and agreed to let me work remotely, then sent an email to my team letting them know I'd be traveling into the following week. The uncomfortable recliner in the corner of the hotel room beckoned, and I collapsed into it, closing my eyes and trying to push through the whirlwind of thoughts from the past few weeks. It became painfully clear to me that, after how hard I'd come down on her sister, there was no way Sarah could confess her affair with Mike and his crew. She knew, without a doubt, that I'd divorce her on the spot. She was right, of course. But as I mulled over the situation, I wondered if, had she been honest from the start, I might have been more fair and reasonable. Instead, Sarah kept lying. I had to find out about her betrayal in the most humiliating way possible, surrounded by my friends and co-workers, with her pimp sitting right in front of me, spilling the details of her involvement in orgies. It was a level of disrespect I could barely fathom. She had treated me with utter contempt, and as a result, our divorce wasn't going to be fair. No, I was going to crush her. I promised myself I would destroy everything, my wife, my best friend, my love, in the most brutal way imaginable. A friendly, amicable split was never going to happen. Pulling myself out of the recliner, I shuffled over to the desk in the corner and started laying out my plans. It was nearly 1:30 a.m. by the time I had sketched out a strategy for dealing with my lying, cheating wife. If my plan went poorly, Sarah's heart would be broken. But if everything lined up like I thought it would, she'd be shattered, left in ruins on the curb. The next morning, I managed to book an appointment with a divorce attorney for the following day. Despite the lawyer's advice, I held off on dividing our finances. That part would come later. Instead, I moved into an extended stay hotel and set up a remote office there. I ignored all of Sarah's calls and texts until Friday, when I finally messaged her saying I'd be gone for the weekend. Her response was frantic. She called all weekend, begging me to call her back. Over the weekend, I purchased everything I needed to set my plan in motion. With my checklist complete, I headed to the mountains for a long hike on Sunday. When I returned to the hotel and turned my phone back on, it was flooded with missed calls and texts from Sarah, her family, and a few work colleagues. Apparently, she was losing her mind trying to figure out where I'd disappeared to. Monday and Tuesday, I worked remotely from the hotel, tying up all the loose ends I could before I'd be out of the office on Wednesday. That day was D-Day. After breakfast, I checked out of the hotel and drove home. On the way, I swung by Sarah's workplace to confirm her car was parked there. Once I was sure she was at work, I placed a GPS tracker under her seat. Back at home, it took me a couple of hours to set up everything I needed, equipment and props all in place. By early afternoon, I was ready. At 2 p.m., I lit a fire in the living room fireplace. It reminded me of those cozy winter weekends when Sarah and I would curl up with a glass of wine, watching the flames flicker and dance. But today wasn't one of those chilly February nights. It was mid-September, and the outdoor temperature was sitting at a sweltering 84 degrees Fahrenheit. At 3 p.m., I texted Sarah, "Just got home. My phone rang almost instantly. I let the call go to voicemail. She didn't leave a message but instead shot back an angry text. I watched the GPS indicator on my laptop, fully expecting her to leave work immediately. But she didn't. The fire roared in the hearth, and I continued tossing logs on, feeding the flames. By 5:55 p.m., when the GPS finally showed Sarah heading home, the living room was an oven. The temperature must have been well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect, I thought. My heart had gone cold. I gritted my teeth and braced myself for her arrival. There was a 3-minute gap between the sound of the garage door opening and Sarah finally stepping into the kitchen. I heard her drop her briefcase by the door, and I could feel her presence as she stood at the entrance to the living room. She walked in and found me sitting on the couch, staring at the fire. On the table in front of me was a plate of cheese and crackers, along with a bottle of wine. I held one glass in my hand, and a second glass sat at the far end of the table, waiting for her. "What the hell are you doing? It's unbearable in here," Sarah said, wiping the sweat from her forehead. I slowly turned from the fire to face her. "What does it look like I'm doing?" "I've prepared a romantic evening for my wife," I replied. Beads of sweat were already forming on her forehead, sliding down her cheeks. "Romantic?" she repeated, the word getting stuck in her throat. She didn't finish her thought. Instead, she stepped closer to the fire, bent down, and picked up something half-burned from the stone hearth. She studied it for a moment before stepping back, her eyes darting to the top shelf of the bookcase. Then she spun around, almost too quickly, her expression one of pure horror as she held up the smoldering front cover of a book, the only part that had escaped the flames. Sarah was too stunned to speak, so I filled the silence. "We didn't have any kindling for the fire, so I used a few of those old books," I said casually, nodding toward the now empty space on the top shelf where she kept her prized collection. "I only used 4 or 5. Don't worry, we've got plenty more for the next fire." As I spoke, I rose from the couch, grabbed her glass of wine, and extended it toward her. I watched as her expression shifted from confusion to rage. On the day Sarah was born, her father had gifted her a book, the most popular children's book of the year. Inside, on the first blank page, he'd written her a heartfelt note, describing all his hopes and dreams for his little girl. It became a tradition, one book every birthday for 28 years, each with a message from her father, reminding her of his love. I could see the fury in her eyes as she screamed and swung at me. Whether she intended to slap or punch, I couldn't say, but her hand connected hard with my face. Pain shot through my left eye as her fingernails scratched deep into my cheek. The wine spilled from both glasses, soaking the front of my shirt and pants. Then, just as quickly as it started, her rage shifted again. Tears filled her eyes, and I saw confusion overwhelm her. Without saying a word, she turned and ran upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. Despite the devastation I felt, knowing our marriage was truly over, I allowed myself a small smile. My plan had worked perfectly. I glanced in the bathroom mirror and saw that my left eye was red and swelling, with a thin line of blood trickling from where her nails had scratched me. "Let's get this over with," I muttered to myself as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" the operator asked. "My name is Adam Spencer. I need police assistance with a domestic situation. My wife just physically attacked me." After giving the dispatcher my address, she asked, "Are you in a safe place, Mr. Spencer?" "I am. My wife locked herself in the bedroom. I'll be waiting on the front porch for the police." "Do you need medical attention?" she asked. "No, I wasn't hurt too badly." For protocol, the dispatcher stayed on the line until the first police car arrived. I was mindful that the call was being recorded, so I chose my words carefully. Moments after the first patrol car pulled up to the curb, a second arrived. 3 officers walked across the lawn toward the house. "Thanks for coming, officers," I said as they approached. "What's going on?" the grizzled veteran asked, his eyes narrowing. I turned my head to the side so they could clearly see the damage to my left eye. My wife, Sarah, hit me. And why did she do that? He asked, his tone measured. I chose my words carefully. Over the last few months, she's become verbally abusive. I think she's conflicted, she's been hiding an affair that she doesn't realize I'm aware of. Actually, I had planned to serve her with divorce papers tonight. The officer's next question was direct. When we talk to your wife, are we going to find any damage in the house? I've never laid a hand on my wife or any woman in anger, I replied truthfully. The younger officer chimed in. What about firearms? Are there any in the house? I own several handguns, but they're all locked in a gun safe in my office. Sarah doesn't know the combination. The two younger officers nodded and headed inside to speak with Sarah. As they went, I turned to the older one and said, "Would you like to see a video of my wife hitting me?" He squinted, trying to process what I'd just said. After a beat, he asked, "You have footage of the assault?" "I believe so," I answered. I motioned for him to follow me into the kitchen. My laptop was on the counter, and I pulled up the cloud-based storage where the camera footage was saved. I scrolled back about 30 minutes and hit play, stepping back so he could get a clear view of the recording. The officer watched as Sarah and I exchanged words, then saw her hit me before running upstairs. After it ended, he asked to see it again. Once he'd watched it a second time, he radioed in, "Arrest Mrs. Spencer." Almost instantly, I heard Sarah start screaming from upstairs, and my heart began racing. The officer had asked me something, but I hadn't caught it in the commotion. "Are all the rooms in your home under surveillance?" he repeated. It was a line of questioning I'd rather avoid, but I knew I had to be honest. "No, just the living room." He nodded thoughtfully and scratched his chin. "How long have you had the camera in the living room?" I shrugged. "It's a fairly recent addition." Before he could follow up, Sarah's voice rang out from upstairs. "Adam, what the hell is going on? Please, help me." I was about to respond when one of the younger officers yelled, "Sir, this is a police investigation. Please leave immediately." He wasn't talking to me, he was addressing an older man standing in the doorway. With equal authority, the man replied, "I am an official process server, and I'm here to serve Mrs. Sarah Spencer." The man strode confidently past the officers, approaching Sarah as they stepped in closer, ready for anything. He held up an envelope and asked, "Are you Sarah Spencer?" When Sarah nodded, he handed the envelope to one of the officers and said, "Sarah Spencer, you are served." Inside the envelope were divorce papers and a restraining order, barring her from coming near me, our home, or my workplace. Since Sarah was in handcuffs, the officer holding her elbow took the documents from the process server. As the server left, Sarah's panic seemed to fade. A strange calm came over her as she looked at me and asked, "How did you find out?" "Mike told me," I answered coldly. The younger officers led Sarah out to the patrol car, and the older one handed me his card, asking that I email him a copy of the video footage. I stepped back inside, watching through the window as the first patrol car drove off with Sarah in the back seat. The older officer had paused halfway down the front walk. He turned and asked, "I've seen you around the pit stop a few times, haven't I?" "Yeah, I recognize you," I replied. The sergeant gave a small nod. "4 years ago, I divorced my wife for cheating. Now I'm paying alimony, child support, health insurance, and the mortgage on the house where she's living with my kids and her jerk boyfriend. Maybe the next time I see you at the pit stop, I'll buy you a beer, and you can tell me what the heck went down here today." The next day at work, I managed to be somewhat productive, though my mind was still all over the place. Thursday and Friday felt like they dragged on forever, but I got through them. When I pulled into my driveway on Friday night and saw my father-in-law, Steve, sitting on my front step, I groaned out loud. After parking in the garage, I stepped out and called, "You coming in, Steve?" He followed me inside as I poured 2 extra-large glasses of Knob Creek. We sat at the kitchen table in silence, slowly sipping our drinks for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Steve broke the silence. "She was cheating too, wasn't she?" he asked, his voice soft but direct. I just nodded, not sure what else to say. "Is there any hope?" he asked, his face heavy with a sadness I hadn't seen before. I took a couple of long sips, trying to steady myself enough to be respectful to him. "It wasn't just one time, Steve, and it wasn't just one guy." He looked at me in disbelief, like he needed to hear it again to let it sink in. "It wasn't even just one man at a time," I added, my voice quieter this time, knowing how painful this was for him to hear. Steve slumped in his chair, the color draining from his face. A single tear rolled down his cheek. We sat there together for a long while, both of us lost in our thoughts, the air thick with grief. "Mary and Jenny didn't learn this from their mother or me," Steve finally said, his voice raspy, his eyes hard and intense. Several more minutes passed before Steve stood up, slowly walking around the table. As I got to my feet, he pulled me into a tight bear hug and wept into my shoulder. His pain was palpable, and I hugged him back, not knowing how to console a man who had just learned that his daughter had shattered everything he thought he knew. When he finally let go, Steve shuffled toward the door, moving like a man who had aged years in mere moments. With his hand on the doorknob, he paused and glanced back at me. "Burning those books, that was a really crappy thing to do," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. I had nearly forgotten about that stunt, the one I pulled to spark the altercation with Sarah. I quickly shouted, "Wait, hold on." I rushed to the kitchen and came back with a small box in hand. Handing it to Steve, I watched as he opened it, his eyes widening in disbelief. "I know how much those books mean to you, Steve. I never would have actually destroyed them," I explained. "Then how?" Steve couldn't even finish his thought, still too stunned. "I went to a bookstore and bought replacement copies," I said, smiling softly. Steve didn't say anything. He just nodded, his expression softening, then turned and quietly walked out the door. The next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and the local newspaper, something caught my eye that made me smile. In the local section of the Hartford Times, I read the following. West Hartford police investigate brutal assault. West Hartford police are currently investigating the vicious assault of a local man in the rear parking lot of Tops Bar in the Elmwood section of the city. Michael Charmed was attacked around 10:30 p.m. and sustained extensive injuries, requiring hospitalization. Police have several leads and expect to make an arrest soon. It was a bright, sunny November morning. I watched as a red Ford SUV pulled into the parking lot, a few spaces away from where I sat. The driver slowly climbed out of the vehicle, his movements stiff and deliberate. "Hey, Mike, you look like hell," I called out, a smirk on my face. I was sitting on the tailgate of my F-150, parked right in front of Jackson Physical Therapy. I'd heard through the grapevine that Mike had a 10:30 a.m. appointment that day. "You know, it might be smart to get yourself a handicap tag," I added, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "That way, you can park closer to the building, like all the other cripples." In addition to his wrecked knees and feet, Mike's jaw was still wired shut, and it would be at least another month before he could speak properly. He didn't respond, but the hate in his eyes was unmistakable. I gave him credit, though. He hobbled over with a cane, stopping about 10 feet from where I sat. Mike knew that both Scott and I had been questioned by the police, but we were cleared. I figured, deep down, he suspected we had a hand in his beating. Now, standing there, he knew for sure. He just stood there, glaring, no doubt fantasizing about all the horrible things he'd do to me if he had the chance. "You know, Mike," I said, keeping my tone casual, "if anything ever happens to me, like, say I die in a plane crash, drown while on vacation, or take a nasty fall down the stairs, I've made arrangements. My friends will visit your mother and sisters. I saw a slight tremor in his arm as he tightened his grip on the cane. They'll break their faces the same way they broke yours, I continued. They'll destroy their legs just like your legs. And, Mike, I added, pausing to make sure he was paying attention, they'll kick them in the crotch just like they did to you. I let the weight of my words sink in before I finished. And while your mother and sisters are writhing in pain, my friends will make sure they know it's your fault. Mike stared at me for a long, tense moment before he gave me a slight nod, not exactly a truce, but a clear sign he understood the message. He turned and hobbled toward the entrance of the building. That was the last time I ever saw Mike charmed. A few weeks later, I handed my divorce lawyer power of attorney to handle everything related to my separation from Sarah. We didn't have kids, we both made about the same money, and at that point, I didn't care about anything except getting her out of my life. A call from my lawyer confirmed that everything was set and we had reached an agreement. However, my lawyer added, Sarah won't sign off until she has a chance to talk to you. I muttered a curse under my breath, but my lawyer told me to just let her speak. Get it over with, she said. Fine, I replied, resigned. Here's the deal, Sarah signs the papers and you confirm everything's official. Then I'll meet her for 1 hour in the conference room at your office. That should work, my lawyer agreed, and the call ended. 3 days later, I sat in the conference room, waiting. June, the paralegal, knocked on the door, cracked it open, and let me know everything had been signed and notarized. She nodded and stepped back, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway. It was clear Sarah had put some effort into her appearance, her makeup was perfect, her outfit carefully chosen. But none of that mattered to me anymore. Even dressed casually, with her hair in a ponytail, she'd always been a knockout in my eyes. She circled the table, leaned down, and kissed me on the cheek before sitting across from me. Are you as nervous as I am? Sarah asked, her voice barely steady. I took a moment before answering. I'm not nervous. I'm more anxious. I just want to get this over with and move on with my life. Tears started streaming down her cheeks. I was blackmailed, she said. Mike threatened to post videos of Jenny online. I wasn't shocked, her dad had already mentioned that during the early stages of the divorce. It might have started with blackmail, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm, but I've seen the videos. I watched you reach climax over and over, and it was real. You weren't faking. You asked for more intensity, more everything. Every time you weren't otherwise engaged, you were begging for it. I could feel my anger rising, so I took a moment to collect myself. After a few deep breaths, I continued, maybe you felt coerced, but that's no excuse for wrecking our marriage. Just because you found out Jenny was cheating doesn't mean you had to turn into a cheater too. Sarah exploded. I was so confused. I didn't know what else to do. What other choice did I have? You could have, and should have, trusted me, I said, frustration lacing my words. I grew even angrier when she rolled her eyes. If you'd come to me, we could have gone to the police and filed a report. Maybe they wouldn't have been able to do anything, but we'd have at least tried. At the very least, his wife and his job would have found out, and we'd have had some satisfaction. More importantly, we'd still be together. But you didn't trust me. Honestly, I'm not sure if you ever did. What kind of trust are you even talking about? She shot back, her voice rising. I answered her with a question of my own. Do you remember why we broke up the first time? The first time? You mean back in high school? Sarah looked baffled. What does that have to do with anything? In high school, you didn't trust me enough to tell me that you wanted to help your neighbor, Jimmy, by going to prom with him, I said. You've got to be kidding me, she replied, disbelief dripping from her words. I was a dumb high school kid, worried about hurting my first serious boyfriend's feelings. Were you a dumb college kid too? I asked. When she gave me a puzzled look, I continued, on Labor Day weekend, before you started college, we made love at Simpson Lake. Right after, we promised we'd stay faithful and get married after school. That promise of yours lasted, what? 10 days. Sarah snapped back, are you telling me you were completely faithful your first year in college? I ignored her attempt to deflect. That's not the point. My point is, whether you admit it or not, I've always questioned whether you truly trusted me. And right now, I think we both know I have every reason not to trust a single word that comes out of your mouth. I went on, you didn't just lie, you've been playing word games and hiding the truth from the start. Sarah tried to change the subject. I haven't seen Mike since everything went down. I couldn't help but smirk. Really? Mike had a little accident, I said. He's not exactly functioning at his previous level. Her face twisted in confusion. What are you talking about? Well, let's just say that among his many injuries, both of his testicles were ruptured. They had to surgically remove one. Her voice dropped to a whisper. How could you possibly know that? I know because I paid to make sure it happened, I said, staring directly into her eyes. Sarah's hands shot up to cover her face, her wide eyes filled with disbelief. He's a dangerous man, Adam. I'm scared for you, she said, her voice trembling. I met with Mike a few weeks after his accident, I replied calmly, and we had a very civilized conversation. I'm pretty confident I convinced him that it was in his best interest to end our association. Sarah's expression softened, shifting from fear to something that almost looked like love. It was a look I'd seen on her face countless times before. You still love me, Sarah nearly shouted, her face lighting up with a flicker of hope. Her outburst caught me so off guard that I actually laughed. Frustrated, she pressed on. You can't tell me you don't love me. I shrugged. You're right. I can't say I don't love you. But I also can't say I do. What you need to understand is that I'm not willing to put in the time or effort to grow whatever love might still be left. Sarah looked like she was about to explode. How can you say that? It's simple, I said, locking eyes with her. You aren't worth it. She sank back into her chair, shrinking before my eyes. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as tears poured down her cheeks, her mind clearly struggling to process what I had just said. I reached into the folder that had been sitting on the table in front of me and pulled out 3 pictures. One by one, I laid them down in front of her. The first showed Sarah completely naked, legs spread wide. The second had her on all fours. In the third, she was on her knees, smiling. The bottom line is this, I said coldly, staring at her. My future children and I deserve someone better than the vile woman in those photos as their mother and my wife. I stood up, looked at her one last time, and said, Goodbye, Sarah. Without another word, I turned and walked out. A few days later, Sarah was sentenced to 50 hours of community service for the domestic violence case. It took another 7 months for our divorce to be finalized. I sold the house and gave Sarah her share of the proceeds. Afterward, I moved to a different town but kept my job. Scott filed for divorce as well, though he stayed in the same town. Every now and then, I get a call from Steve, checking in to see how things are going. I always appreciate his calls. Scott and I meet up occasionally when he's in town for work. Life hasn't been easy, but I know we're both better off this way.